So it's now my very great privilege to introduce our keynote for today. So my own connection to Nick Earls began when he wrote Zigzag Street, which is a weird little street just 2 doors away from where I had lived. I'd gone to the Night Owl just up the road and all the things people around Zigzag Street do. He was another author making my haunt famous. In Bachelor Kisses, his protagonist worked at the Greenslopes Repatriation Hospital, which was just a few doors from where I spent all my childhood. So he was writing about Brisbane people doing Brisbane things and pretty much stalking me. He has used his refreshing and authentic voice to write for adults, for young people, for children, with many of his novels being adapted to stage and some to screen. He's recently completed his PhD, and the question marks on my page were where I was going to find out what it was about, but I don't know. I'm sure he does. There we go. So Nick has always been very generous in sharing his passion for storytelling with his public. At last year's pre-conference event, Nick created an individual yarn for each person in the line for the book signing. I know that because I had the security staff breathing down my neck to say, really, we should be out of here and I should be home. So I had to cut him off. Lucky for us, Nick is back here today to share his love of story with us.
Thank you very much, Fiona. It's great to be here today and to be stalking you once again in such a respectable way. She doesn't know, but I'm actually only here because I put an app on Fiona's phone a while back that lets me know where she is at all times. And I was hanging around outside hoping to bump into her, and the security people came up to me and said, "What are you doing here?" And I had to come up with something, so I said, "I'm here to do a keynote." And so they just threw me in here and let's see how I go. So, yeah, I'll try this. Okay. So in 2013, after sending my novel Analog Men to Random House as the third book in a 3-book contract, I realised that the 5 best ideas I had waiting for me were destined to be novella-sized. I also realised that might not be welcome news at Random House. And why is that? Well, as Stephen King said, he called the novella an anarchy-ridden literary banana republic to make even the most stout-hearted writer of fiction shake and shiver in his boots because, as he says, as far as marketability goes, you're in a heap of trouble. Joe Fassler, an American writer of fiction and non-fiction in The Atlantic, said, "A broad canyon yawns between the viable long story and the short novel. This is the 50,000-word abyss, and anything that falls within it is generally considered untouchable." Howard Nemeroff, a Pulitzer Prize winner and Stanford professor, called the novella commercially useless and unacceptable, which is kind of blunt, to say the least. Richard Ford, I'm a great fan of Richard Ford, legendary American writer, great writer of novella-length fiction, interestingly, and editor of the book that was meant to be the Granta Book of the American novella, but in his hands became the Granta Book of the American long story because, as he said, "I'm not mad at the word, I just don't know what I might mean if I used it." But it does have its fans. To name just one, the English writer Ian McEwan, who called the novella the perfect form of prose fiction. It is the beautiful daughter of a rambling, bloated, ill-shaven giant. As a writer, the novella is a great chance to take your best novelist stuff and really focus it. As a reader, it goes deep, but it doesn't go long. It gives you what a novel gives you. It lets you commit to a character and a story. It handles details cleverly. It reveals what it needs to in unexpected ways. It gets as complicated as it needs to, and it doesn't take all night to do it. So what's with the awkward reputation when some great writers have done some of their best work when writing novellas? It's about money. It costs about as much to make a smallish paper book as it does a medium-sized one, and there's a fear that book buyers buy books by the kilo. I don't know if they do or not, But regardless of how we buy books, pick any book you've loved. How often have you said, I loved that book because it was so heavy, or so thick, or so long? How about never? We love the books that grab us and hold on to us and mean something, and a great novella can do just that as well as a novel. Why do I think it's worth taking a fresh look at novellas now? There are a number of reasons, but this guy is one of them. We all know that is Psy doing Gangnam Style, and we know that because of how many times it's been watched and the attention it got. By December 2012, after just a matter of months, it had been watched 1 billion times on YouTube. If you do the maths on that, and it was watched by one person each time, and they watched all the way to the end, that amounts to 50 million hours of human activity. If a fifth of that time would otherwise have gone to reading, that's the equivalent of 1 million novels worth of reading that never happened. But it's not just him, is it? Because what's new in our lives this century is not just one video on the platform to watch it. It's also Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, MySpace. Well, not so much MySpace. That's one person waiting for the order to turn the lights out. But anyway, but it's also news sites, op-ed sites, lifestyle sites, daggy but awesome blogs. It's these people. It's several million of these. And it's all of these. And so many free-to-air channels, I'm starting to wonder if any house in America is now renovated by anyone other than a photogenic couple with a TV deal. And it's Angry Birds, Candy Crush Saga, Minecraft, Fortnite, and an implausible 425 million paid downloads to mobile phones of this in the 8 years to 2014. Yes, Tetris, and that is an 8-year period, and that's only mobile phones and only paid. 425 million downloads. How big a change in the world is that? Here's a picture of the world video game industry in 1973. Here's a picture of the world video game industry in 1972. By the time Gangnam Style hit 1 billion views, the world video game industry was $60 billion a year. In the less than 6 years since, Gangnam Style has passed 3 billion views, and this year the world video game industry is predicted to hit $138 billion. That's larger than total global book sales. It's 3 times the global film industry, and next year video games are likely to gross more than sport. That is all sport in the world. And most of us play free games that don't even contribute to the sales figures. Why is this important in a discussion about novellas? There was a time when commuters on trains looked like this. Now they look like this. And there's work, family, study. There are lots of inputs in our lives. We have more inputs than we've ever had before. And if I think about my own life, a few years ago, I took Jonathan Franzen's Purity on a holiday to the Gold Coast in January. By the end of that time, I'd read 100 pages of it, and we all know Jonathan Franzen's novels are not short. So it was 563 pages long. I finished that book in late April. There were regularly times when I was thinking, who is Andreas, when he was one of the lead characters? And that's not a reading experience I want to have. I'm guessing I'm not the only person in this room with a pile of books beside the bed stockpiled for holidays. Anyone else in that position? Yes, almost all of us. Yeah. And the same, or a version of it, applies to your students. Whether or not they all have piles of books waiting to be read, they very likely have lives overloaded with inputs and many competing demands on their time. So maybe the time is right for something with a novel's intensity, but 2 to 3 hours long. I'm not for a moment saying you or I or they should give up on novels, but I'm saying maybe we should have novellas more in our minds as an option than we tend to, or than we're trained to by the way the publishing industry operates. Despite what Richard Ford says, I don't think a novella is a short story that got a bit long. A novella has a complexity a short story doesn't. A novella can be analysed and explored using many of the tools we use on novels in a way that a short story typically can't. So what is a novella? What is it now? What does it offer? How does it work from the point of view of the writer? How does it work from the point of view of the reader? How might it work in a teaching environment? First, what is it? And this is my PhD. This is where this all comes from. We traditionally, when we think of the novella, because it's it's between the short story and the novel, we think of it as a very in-between thing, and we define it based on its in-betweenness, and we get far too obsessed about actually putting a length on it, a number on it, saying how long it should be. And we either naturally do that, or we're pushed into doing that. So how does that work out when we look at how people define novellas by length? Well, here's a sample of novella length limits from a range of writers, academics, and competitions. And as you'll see, if you look closely at that, you'll see that to make all those people happy, you either have to hit precisely 20,000 words, or you decide that length is only relevant when entering competitions, and you move on to something much more interesting, and that is form. Canadian writer and academic George Feverling there, who said, the novella isn't simply longer than even a long short story and shorter than a novel, it's also more complex than the first, but not so complex as the second, in structure, in characterisation, the works. So, what are the works? By which I don't mean, let's do a review of all possible novella characteristics debated over the past 200 years. I mean, what tools can a writer in this century bring to a work likely to be around 20,000 words long to make it as compelling as possible? In my PhD research, I examined the use of writing tools in the creation of novellas across several centuries and languages in order to settle on tools that are sufficiently central to contemporary novella practice as to feel like hallmarks of the form today. I ended up with a list of 6 that I want to go into now. Cast aside along the way were old devices once seen as almost obligatory but no longer in common use, devices that appear in a minority of novellas, and devices that are common to fiction generally. For example, if you Google novella characteristics, you'll find a lot of people mentioning conflict. That's such core business for fiction across the board that I'm not going to single it out as a novella characteristic. There are 2 reasons I want to look at the tools that I did settle on. One is they might be useful anytime you or your students are creating a substantial piece of fiction. Use these tools consciously and actively, and I think the likelihood of creating a compelling novella are substantially increased. The other is that knowledge of these tools can be brought to novella reading. How did the writer use them to create the effect they created? If we turn the tools into questions when we read novellas, we can get a much better idea of how the thing works the way it does. So let's look at those tools, and then I'll look at a couple of my novellas as case studies of their application. To start with plot lines, with a short story, we're typically writing our way through one idea once. With a novel, we see typically multiple plot lines weaving through and around each other, all calling for some kind of resolution. With a novella, we typically either see one plot line needing depth and time to reveal itself through clever use of detail in a way that is beyond the ambit of a short story, or 2 plot lines that can cast light on each other in interesting ways to reveal more about the theme. Do this deliberately when writing, this selection, limitation and manipulation of plot lines, and it becomes a powerful tool. Examine a novella with this tool in mind and you'll see it at work. You'll see how plot lines interact and push and pull each other to bring backstory details strategically and artfully to the surface and to direct the narrative, often in unexpected and rewarding ways. That process applies to the 5 other tools that follow. As a reader, know the tool and you'll be able to find it at work and see its contribution to the reading experience. There's one kind of very famous version of the 2 plotline idea in novellas, and that is the framing story. And you can sometimes one story is used to frame others, so you have or you can nest a storyline within another storyline, and that's not an essential part of novella writing, so that's not on my list of things that are essential, and it's not particular to novellas. It's a big deal with early novellas. If we think of the Decameron, for instance, there you've got the framing story of people fleeing Florence during a time of plague, and embedded within that you've got multiple other stories, which were called the novellas that were part of that. Big also with the German writers 200 years ago. and slightly more recently, Conrad's Heart of Darkness also has a frame story. But why is it worth thinking about in the 21st century? I think it's worth thinking about if it adds another dimension, if the outer story isn't merely a frame, if the embedded story and the story it's embedded in can do something to each other. So it's a more dynamic kind of relationship. Beyond plot lines, there's details. With a short story, we've been told since the mid-19th century that you've got to hold back. A short story is about restraint. Every word needs to earn its place, and we show restraint with details there too. With a novella, we can embrace detail, but embrace it in a specific and purposeful way. To use details to cast light on character and themes from different perspectives. What details does your narrator, if you have one, see? How can a detail bring a thought to the surface or subtly direct action? Conscious use of detail can be a powerful tool. Then we've got intensity and expansion, something talked about as a novella characteristic since the 1970s. Named by an American academic called Judith Leibovitz, the double effect of intensity and expansion. And I read her book on that and have my own understanding of what she was saying from that. And to me, it feels like if you focus on one theme and limited plot lines and characters within a contained world and contained time period, but embrace detail, you can create intensity. And if you get it right, you've created something about characters that might be highly specific, but that also generalises. You're saying something about other humans, and that's the expansion. And the novella lets you do that powerfully. Then, I've been talking about this a bit with the other elements, but let's talk about it specifically, characterisation. As a writer, if you need a cast like a Russian novel, it's not a novella. If you have a story that will benefit from containment and focus and a contained cast of characters to whom you can give a lot of attention, you might just have a novella. It's great for psychology and for revealing interior worlds, great for exploring a protagonist's response to the moment of change or crisis or realisation, and great for revealing complex relationships between people in interesting ways. Next, layering. By mastering detail and understanding your objective and how you want to get there, you can reveal your character in layers. This is a thing we often see in novels, but it works very well in novellas too. And it gets back to detail, but a hierarchy of detail. In a novella, there is time to get to know characters, to really feel that they have the complexity of people. How do you want them to look at the end? How do you want them to look at the start? And how do you manage each subtle shift in between? Again, thinking consciously about this as the writer lets you control this and lets you use it as a tool. And looking for it consciously as a reader lets you find how the writer's done it and where they've done it. And the final one is leave room. Another American academic, Jesse Lee Kercheval, has said, leave room for readers to come to terms with what has happened to your characters. Leave room for falling action and resolution, for an ending that resembles a novel's more than it does a short story's. You might be embracing detail, but don't use detail to fill in all the blanks. Those blanks are meaningful and valuable for the reader. Let the reader witness the details and their effects, and from that build their own sense of the characters and what's at stake. I think a novella is an opportunity to give the reader the satisfaction of applying their knowledge of humans and working some things out. Now for some case studies to see all that at work. Let's take a look at how I applied it when planning and writing the first two novellas in my Wisdom Tree series. But before I do that, a quick disclaimer. I know some schools already have groups of students reading some of my novellas, and of course I'm very happy about that, and please keep doing it. But I should mention they're not written with an age group market in mind, and while 4 of them I think are pretty non-controversial, the first, if we had rating systems for books the way we do for TV, will be set to contain coarse language and adult themes. Ironically, while I'm saying that as some kind of warning, I say that knowing that coarse language and adult themes are 2 of the major preoccupations of the teenage boys I know. And there's nothing in any of these novellas that will be new to any of them. For the first one, rappers. There's a rapper. I thought rappers could be interesting. For a start, this one's non-rapper first name is Algernon, and his jewellery seems to be advocating ballet moves. I don't quite get that, but there's a lot I don't get. I'm too old to get all this stuff now. But I think rapper phenomenology is interesting. That story of someone from a challenging background who posts a bit of stuff on YouTube and Jay-Z finds it and they're precipitously hurled into a kind of fame they're utterly unprepared for. That's an interesting character. That's got to be of interest to me as a writer. So I was interested in that. But then I thought, how do I get to write from the rapper's point of view? And then I thought, maybe I don't. I'm not sure I can really convincingly get into that head. And then I thought, I'm not sure I should even try, because maybe I should leave that to the rappers to do. But then I thought maybe it'd be more interesting if I can't get into that head, if my narrator was someone who would give us a very close look at the rapper but never get properly inside that person's head, which instantly means I've now got two characters to deal with. I've got a rapper character and a narrator character. So who's this narrator going to be, and why is this person trying to get into a rapper's head, and how is this person someone I feel comfortable inhabiting? So I thought the narrator then is a 40-ish Australian rock journo from Brisbane who is in New York to interview the rapper. I can be that guy. I can get into that head. I can do that. So I had these two characters, and I went for a run around the UQ campus near where I live one day, and I often kind of just think about something while I'm out running. I'm away from the desk. I'm not hard at work. So then I thought, what's the most amusing rapper name I can come up with? And I thought, okay, it's a rapper name. It's got to have some dodgy spelling. It's got to have a symbol in the middle. It's got to have those sorts of things about it. And I came up with Nasty Boy, NATIBOI. I thought, yeah, I want to write about Nasty Boy. So came up with ideas for him. And I had Jeff Foster, the journalist, and I started thinking, as all writers should, what's at stake for these people? What's at stake for the two of them? And also, what do I get out of the two of them? How do they meet? How does it go? What's actually happening here? So they meet on a shopping spree in Bloomingdale's flagship department store in Manhattan. So Nasty Boy can flaunt his success, but it doesn't quite work out that way. And I thought, I want to make him more than just the surface. You'll see that bragging rapper on the surface, of course, but there's going to be more, and what's that going to be? And that's an interesting part of the game, thinking what's it going to be and how do we get there. So he's a mixture of fragile and selfish and appalling. He gets upset at small things, and I had to search then for the details to reveal those different aspects of him. And I thought, I'm going to have someone who's going to be a sort of bridge between these two characters. Nasty Boy is going to have a slightly older person in his life who's going to be his cousin, who's also his manager, and somehow there's going to be some connection with Jeff through that there. So I've got these three people, and I initially called it cargoes since the shopping spree came unstuck over the purchase of some cargo pants, and I decided both Nasty and Jeff are carrying some baggage. So I started thinking, what's Jeff's story? Because he's not just someone I'm sending in, some faceless thing I'm sending in to interview a rapper. If you invent a character, put something into it, put the time in, make that character earn their spot on the page and really get value out of them. So I thought, it's Jeff's story too. It's his story at heart. So what does he bring to New York, and how do I let it find its way in? And then I remembered I'd actually been to New York 4 months before then, I think. And I was there with my partner and our nearly 4-year-old son, and one of the things I did was write an article for News Limited Travel, the News Limited Travel section for their Sunday papers on New York with an under 5. Why not make a trip tax deductible? So, and get slightly paid for it. But yeah, so I was there to do that. So I thought, Jeff's going to write that. He's going to be there with his partner and their young child. Let's make it a 4-year-old daughter. And they're in New York doing that. And I thought back to my time there with my son. And I can remember one day we were pushing in a stroller, mainly to contain him, going down one of the avenues, and he pointed at a building in the distance, and he went, "That's the Empire State Building." And I said, "Yeah, how do you know that?" Thinking, how does an Australian who's not even 4 identify a specific building in a foreign city they've never been to? And when he explained it to me, the answer was, of course, obvious: superheroes. And that was the moment when he realised he was there, that this place was real, that the city of Superman and Spider-Man and Batman was a real place. And the rest of the trip in New York was just awesome for him, and he was in a superhero costume all the time, one superhero or another. And we were up in our hotel room, and he'd be standing at the window looking down at all the rooftops nearby with the water towers on them, and I'd say, what are you doing? He said, Batman's got to show up sometime. And then one day, after 2 consecutive days of non-appalling behaviour, he'd earned the reward of a $15 toy. And so we were going to FAO Schwartz, the toy store, and on the way there he seemed quite a bit more excited than I would normally have thought with that. And I said, so which bit of the toy store do you want to go to? And he said, I want to go to the superhero section. I said, okay, it's a toy store. There might not actually be a superhero section. It's a shop. They'll have some superhero gadgets. There'll be some toys there. It'll even work out. They might not actually have a superhero section. He said, of course they'll have a superhero section. So I thought, got to manage these expectations on the way there. And I said, and what do you actually, is there anything you're particularly looking for from the superhero section? And he went, yeah, I want to hang out with the superheroes. I said, look, it's a shop. I mean, we get toys there, but don't. Why would you expect the superheroes to be there? And he went, come on, think about it. It's New York. It's where they all live. There's no crime. So where else would they hang out? But the biggest toy store. So we went, the whole trip there was me trying to manage these expectations so there was no tantrum when there were no superheroes. And we got there, walked in the front door, and I said to the greeter on the door, because it was New York, so of course there was a greeter on the door, and I said, do you have a superhero section? And she said, yes, we certainly do, up on the 2nd floor. And so my son looked at me, gave me that kind of you idiot look that they seemed to get control of very early on. And so we went over to the escalator, caught it up to the 2nd floor, is going, now look, there'll be toys here, you've got $15. How amazing is that? It's going to be great. Even if there aren't any superheroes here, it's going to be great. He's just looking at me, just going, really? Do I have to listen to this? And so we got to the top, and as he stepped off the escalator, he looked towards the shelves, and who was standing there but Iron Man and Spider-Man, waiting to have their photos taken with kids. So I again got the you're an idiot look, and then he ran over there, and so we got pictures of him shooting web and all that kind of stuff. So it totally worked for him. And when he got back to his childcare, and I said, I knew they'd get him to do a show and tell on his holiday. And I said, he's going to stand up and say he went to New York and hung out with superheroes. And in a sense, it's kind of true, because here's what happened. So just let him do that. So I was thinking we're going to draw in some of that stuff. And I was looking at the photos I took for the article, and I saw this one with my son coming down this curved slide in Central Park. And as you can see there, he's not just wearing a Spider-Man t-shirt, but he is coming down in classic Superman flying pose with a dead serious expression on his face, because Superman always means business. And when I looked at that expression on my son's face, I thought, this is it. I thought, in my story, we're not just kind of, this is not my trip to New York, this is what I need for the story. And in my story, the central character's daughter needs to be a superhero. I'm to tap into some of that intensity on my son's face. She needs to be a superhero. Why does she need to be a superhero? And when I came up with the answer to that, I thought, now I've really got something. I've got something I'm desperate to write, and I really had it. So Jeff has a family story, Nasty has a family story lurking beneath the surface, and to bring them together we've got Nasty's manager and cousin Smokey. Smokey's wife has just gone into labour this night during the interview, and Nasty messes him around in a variety of interesting ways. And I thought that is an intriguing, compact cast of characters. It starts out with these 3 men heading around Manhattan doing this protracted Rolling Stone kind of interview, but then we see more people come into it as well. So then it's about investing in each character, finding the details that will reveal them and propel them in interesting ways, and working out precisely how to sow those seeds. Now, this could have been 2 short stories. It could have been a rapper story and a family story. But bringing them into plausible collision this way, there's a tension between them, and they reveal things about each other, and that's what made this a novella. That's the first in the series, Gotham. One germ for the second novella of the series came from my friend Terry Whitbourne. That's Terry there. This is totally unfair, putting up a photo of Terry that makes him look like a dorky explorer, or someone about to pull a huge sled with his genitals. if you need a sled pulled by, Terry's your guy. But no, anyway, we're moving on. This is how I'm supposed to show. There's Terry. Terry, the sensitive artist. That's one of his artworks behind him. Terry and I worked together on the Word Hunters series for people aged 9 to 12. Terry was the illustrator on that, and he's also an artist as well as working in advertising. And one day he told me a story that quite surprised me about something he had to do for an art exhibition. He was lined up to be part of an exhibition called Seven with Another. There have been a series of those in Brisbane, and what they do is take 7 visual artists, link each one of them up with a person from another art form, and they have to collaborate to produce an object or something as part of the next exhibition, something that fits with the theme. This was the 4th in the series, so the theme was 4. And so Terry and his co-worker decided that they would make the 4 horses of the apocalypse, which they did. And that's not a great photo, and it is a little dark there, but they decided to make hobby horses with actual skulls with ink artwork on each of the skulls related to one of the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. And it's a terrific but quite disturbing work. But there was an element that was more disturbing than that. As Terry said to me, do you know how hard it is in Brisbane to get horses' skulls legally? And he told me his story about how he got the horses' skulls. So he found a provider of horse heads, and somewhere in the Sunshine Coast hinterland, and he drove there one day. And so for the first hour or so, this is like normal, heading to the Sunshine Coast. On the road you'd always used to head to the Sunshine Coast, and then he had to take a left turn off the Bruce Highway and head somewhere that he'd never been before, and then down some kind of winding, unsurfaced road, and then ending up at a property, and it was the right place. He was sent down the back of the property, and down the back of the property there was an enormous shipping container with this huge refrigeration unit attached, and the guy from the property followed him down in the ute and then unbolted the shipping container door and pulled it open, and as it came open there was this sort of gush of vapour, and as it cleared, Terry could see piles of frozen horse parts in there. And you're sort of thinking, I want to get out of here quite quickly, because if they've got a horse container, where's the human container? Like, where's this? And how did they get these in? Anyway, so he quickly loaded his 4 horse heads onto the tarp in the boot of his car, and then got back on the Bruce Highway and headed towards the taxidermist at Burpengary, who was going to boil the heads down and present him with the skulls. Look, this is a weird story. I'm not advocating this as a way to spend a weekend. And as he was going, it was a Sunday afternoon. The traffic was heavy coming back from the coast. Yeah, he started to notice a slight whiff of horse coming from back, and thought, please don't let there be like an RBT thing or anything on the way there, because I don't want anyone to make me open the boot and reveal these legitimately obtained horse heads. So. And he told me this story, and I said, that's amazing. You're never going to write that, are you? Can I have it? And he said, yes, you can. So I had that as part of thinking that was going to be part of something, and then thinking, what am I going to do? There's an artist in the story, and but I thought, it's not going to be the artist doing it. It's going to be someone a step removed from the artist, so that if they're stopped, it's even weirder, because they can't go, on my phone, here's my artwork, here are my installations, this is normal. No, he can't do that, this person. So I thought, it's someone connected with an artist. There's an artist in the story. She does installations. She's aiming to be Australia's representative at the next Venice Biennale. But the narrator is just running an errand for her. Who is this person? Why would someone be driving into the wilderness to get horse heads for an artist? And that's an interesting question to have to answer. So I started thinking about that and thinking, what other dimension or angle can I bring to that? And then I remembered an idea I had a couple of years before for a story that I'd never written. I thought it was going to be a short story idea. And that came about related to an incident involving this ice cream. Have any of you tried that ice cream? How awesome is that ice cream? It's one of the best. I'm going to be bold here. I'm going to go out on a limb and say it's probably the best retail ice cream available anywhere. Yes. One night, one summer, I went to buy groceries at Coles Toowong, not afraid to name them. Went to buy groceries at Coles Toowong, and loaded the trolley with everything, and then got down to the freezer section. And then as I got there, approaching it to buy a tub of this Maggie Beer ice cream and only this, that's when I looked ahead of me and saw that the bit of shelving that was normally Maggie Beers seemed to be empty, and the tags had gone from the shelves. We know that's a bad sign, don't we? Yes. They've destocked Maggie, haven't they? I couldn't face that. I approached the shelves and just stared at them for a while, hoping it would just materialise, which it didn't. There was a staff member nearby who was there with a box cutter putting sorbet on shelves, and I said to her, "Excuse me, I'm just here for a tub of the Maggie Beer burnt for coming home in caramel." And she looked at me tentatively and started to back away, despite being the only one of us with a box cutter. And she said, "I don't think we're stocking that anymore." And I just thought, don't take her down in the aisles of Coles. She didn't make that choice. She's just doing a decent thing, shelving stuff that people might want to buy, even if it's not Maggie Beer, not her fault. And so I just was seething on the inside, but trying to maintain a mask of fake pleasantness on the outside. And she tried to help me by pointing at a random ice cream and going, "But I hear that one's kind of good," and then running away. So I settled for the kind of good ice cream. And trust me, I was settling. It was a total settle. And I went home and I tried it and I thought, that's kind of good. But I didn't want kind of good. I was prepared to pay the full $10 for Maggie. I wanted the best. And so it's the 21st century, so I immediately blazed away a tweet to Coles saying, "What are you thinking, destocking Maggie Beer at Geelong?" And Coles, in a rare burst of candour, replied within minutes saying, "It's pretty much only you buying it, so don't expect it to come back." But that bit of poor behaviour on my part is not a story, so I thought I'm not going to write that. But I thought I'm going to give that moment to someone. I'm going to give that moment to someone who has a lot more at stake. Someone who doesn't just want the ice cream, someone who doesn't just want the Maggie Beer, but someone who needs it. Someone who's had a terrible day in a life that's gone off the rails and just needs something a bit better to happen. And that's who it's going to go to. Someone who walks down the road in the middle of a hot summer night with $20 in his pocket, and his plan is, because he's had a bad time, he's just going to buy a tub of Maggie Beer and a $2 spoon and sit on a random wall outside some yellow brick block of units and just eat as much of this ice cream as he can so something non-terrible happens in his day. That's who's going to get this moment. So I thought I'd give it to a guy who was retrenched at the end of the mining boom, who's living with his rich sister and brother-in-law, and this is about how small his world gets and what it's like to find meaning in it. And something that's been some self-esteem lowering moment in his evening, and he goes out to get this ice cream and has to settle for this kind of good ice cream and sit on a wall eating it. And then I thought, I'm going to give that and the road trip to the same character. He's the brother of the artist who is doing this. He's living in the granny flat under her house. His life isn't where he wants it to be. He's trying to be helpful to justify his place in the house. He has to pick up horse heads, and he cooks the dinners and it's not appreciated, and it's all a bit weird. So then I had these two plot components that are part of the same plot line, but to make it work I needed to build more material to link them and embed them in the same life. And through doing that, I discovered a lot more about my characters. And I found myself with these two elements in parallel. His life on a downward trajectory, her life, the sister's life, on an upward one in the same house. And it's how I was to make those work with each other that would help give it novella potential. So what lets us go deep? What pushes him and draws him out? And I thought he's got a nephew, Harrison, who's 4 years old, who's a bit lost in the big house as well. He's a bit crap at swimming lessons. He's obsessed about a range of things on his LeapPad tablet, particularly science facts, but with no one who's got the time to talk about them, as his father works long hours at his dental practice and his mother works on a piece of art and waits to hear if she's chosen as Australia's rep in Venice. So we have Ryan and his issues and Harrison and his in a car heading into the hinterland to pick up horses' heads. And that seemed to... I thought about that and I thought, I've never read that story before, so let's write that one. So, yeah, I wanted to do that. Again, there's a contained cast of characters and a manageable mission. It's about what we value, what's important in life, and by bringing together Terry's horsehead story and my ice cream whinge, these two separate ideas, and imposing them on one person, there's a great chance to go deep and thread in detail to reveal him in layers while still giving the reader room to work out who he is and what's really at stake. And there's scope to work the themes in the way a novella can to allow for both intensity and expansion. He is precisely who he is, but at the same time, what he's dealing with is recognisable and generalisable. In both of these novellas, I created the protagonist as a protagonist, someone who might be seen as being close to the action but not at the heart of it. The rapper is not the protagonist. The artist is not the protagonist. I've gone for the quieter people in the room, people with issues that are real and I hope compelling, even when they're not highly visible and not always easily defined and to some extent internalised. Novella protagonists are often outsiders. I don't think that makes my list of novella characteristics because it's true when it's true and it's not when it isn't. But with a lot of novellas looking deep into character psychology and transformation, someone who is a step removed from the action, but close enough not just to observe it, but have a stake in it, is a good fit with the novella. There's plenty to work with, plenty that can affect them in the way you need them to be affected, but also plenty of scope to spend time in their heads when you need to, and to allow them to observe all the detail you need. There are a lot of great and powerful things to think about when writing novellas, and scope for plenty of fascinating and deep exploration and discussion when reading them. For the student who is resisting reading, the offer of a small book might get them over the line, make it the right small book, the right novella for them, and there's scope for them to be sucked in and to find a lot more in there than they were expecting. For the student not resisting reading, but who is crushed by time pressure, the right novella for them will have a depth and complexity that will allow them to bring all their analytical tools to bear and to show you that they can think deeply and insightfully. Thank you.
We have time for some questions. Have we got some questions?
Thank you. Nick, I remember being a teacher back in Frankston 16 years ago with a group of boys and trying to find ways into reading. And I stayed in that school over 7 years and discovered your novels. Do you think the kinds of issues you need to write about for young people now are changing? So I'm thinking about 16 years ago versus now. Has adolescence changed? Have these kids changed in the kinds of stories we have to give them?
Oh, look, I think that's a very interesting question, and it's had quite an impact on me as a writer because I think the most important thing to be is relevant. And I think a whole range of works might click with a whole range of students, and you will know your students and be in the best position to assess what might be right for them. And I think if we're thinking about genres other than realism, then the rules might be slightly different, but I tend to write realism, and if you're writing realism with the intent of connecting it with a teenage readership, then there's a real need to be immediately relevant to that readership. And my feeling is that while teenagers themselves might not have changed, some of the very significant mechanics of teenage life have changed, not just since I was a teenager, but since a lot of people a long time after I was a teenager were teenagers. So in the 1990s, I felt that some of the things I went through when finishing school were still relevant enough in terms of the mechanics that I could tap into that. And whereas now, if I think about how teenagers communicate and the inputs they have into their lives, if I were to write realism about teenagers and for teenagers now, I feel that I really needed to get that right. And that is, I think, a challenge that writers face the longer they get past their teenage years, but a challenge that we face in a way now that I don't think we faced it before. I think the changes in the practical aspects of teenage communication and inputs in their lives and the language they use and a whole lot of things, I think for me it seems that what's happened in the last decade or so with phones and the apps on them and all of that seems like a more dramatic shift than, say, the shift from the 80s to the 90s.
Yes, this is a bit on the same theme because we study a lot of texts that are quite old and we also study a lot of contemporary texts. I guess my question is, do you see there's a different kind of usefulness in studying a contemporary text versus an older text? And you've obviously been reading a lot of novellas from history, so what are some of the gems we can find in the older texts that we can't find now, and what are some of the gems we can find in contemporary texts that we can't get from?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting thing to think through, because I think if we're aiming to make work relevant and make it something that connects with students, we shouldn't go so far as to rule out everything written more than 10 years ago. I think some of the great works of whatever length teach us, give us so much about their characters that we can tap into the character and connect with that person's experience, whether that character is fighting the Battle of Agincourt or texting someone who may or may not like them enough. And so I think it's great to have a mixture of those reading experiences, so that one of the things that reading does is expose students to lives beyond their own in a kind of deep way, a deep and thought-provoking way. So whether that's rebel adolescence in the 1950s or who knows what, we now get a different thing out of that. The reader now can connect with the character, can explore the character, can see how that person works as a human and probably can relate to quite a bit of that, but then see a human in an environment that's unfamiliar to them and explore that as a thing that's worth exploring in its own right. And if I think about how my books in the 90s, I mean, some of them are still in schools after January and 48 Shades of Brown. If I tried to write those stories now, or if I tried to write Zigzag Street now and make it work in a contemporary way, so many things would be very different because communication is so much easier. It's like if you couldn't have Seinfeld now. If you made Seinfeld now, most episodes will be dramatically different because the core thing at the heart of most episodes of Seinfeld is poor communication. And if they all had mobile phones, Seinfeld wouldn't happen. But I think even that would be an interesting exercise, would be to take a book or a text of any kind from a time before apps and the devices we all carry with us, look at how those characters are interacting, and then see if you can explore that as if it was now, and they had as if they had the devices we had, and see how differently it might pan out. So I think I think it's good to think about the great things that the great works that aren't recent have to offer us, particularly in terms of how to tell a story, and particularly with what they reveal about characters. But now, I mean, readers looking at them now are going to be looking at them through their own contemporary prism, and that itself is an interesting thing. And I think if we can manage a balance between texts that feel as though they have some immediacy and connection with their lives, but also texts that show them the lives of other humans who don't have those gadgets, I think that's good.
Can I ask a follow-on from that then? If you're operating in a story world where communication is much easier, have you found that has changed the types of stories you write if you can't really use that as a complication anymore? Can you talk us through how that impacts on your storylines?
Yes, it was an interesting thing for me to work through over a series of books. I mean, I've written 26 books now, so a number of those preceded contemporary communications and a number don't. And it has a real impact on the shape the story arcs take. If you need people not to be able to get in contact with each other, you've got to work out how to do that. There was a brief period 10 years ago or thereabouts, and if you look at movies from then and TV from then, you'll find a disproportionate number of times when people's mobile phone batteries run flat, or there's somewhere where they don't get a signal. And that's that transitional phase where you've got people who have grown up and had careers writing in times when lack of communication was an easy thing that you didn't need to explain, to suddenly they have that as a tool, but the tool's kind of broken, so they've got to fake their way through it. More recently, you don't have that, because people have been writing long enough in worlds that have the communicability that we do now. So it actually means that from the start, I'm thinking about the stories and the way the characters interact in somewhat different ways. And while it's much harder to have multiple periods in a story where people can't communicate, because in the end it just looks so like you're faking it, there's still lots of scope for miscommunication, let's face that. So if you're writing the kind of Seinfeldian comedy of manners sort of thing where communication is an issue, the communication issue is not now that George and Jerry can't talk, but the communication issue now will be that the text message has multiple meanings and the wrong one is chosen. So it blocks some things, it presents some challenges, but it also presents some opportunities as well, and allows you to find contemporary corollaries for those devices that we would have used before, I think. But it is interesting that I think there is a period where we were still stumbling around and trying to do that, and a lot of mobile phones ran flat. And but I think we're past that now.
Nick, thanks for your talk. I was just wondering, do you have any recommendations of good novellas from your research that you think would be good for us to study in class with our students?
I haven't thought of novellas. I haven't thought of the novellas that I've looked at from that perspective, I must admit, since I was looking at them primarily from my thesis was particularly about novella publishing in the 21st century and looking at developing a new novella publishing model, which is what I did, releasing my series at monthly intervals as individual books, simultaneously as paper books, e-books and audiobooks, which is not a thing people have tried before. But there are the classics like Breakfast at Tiffany's and those sort of novellas around, and Delia Falconer's The Lost Thoughts of Soldiers, I think, is a very good book, but not necessarily particularly relevant for a contemporary Australian teenage readership. I think there are a lot of writers who are known for their short fiction who have written some impressive novellas that are the kind of anchor novella in a short story collection. And it's worth looking for some of those in the work of Alice Munro and people like that as well. I should have a better, more obvious list than I do, I realise.
One more, this is the last one.
Just a quick question. So as an English teacher, I suppose the difficult part is you've had a breadth of experiences and fascinating ones that relate to horse heads and travelling, but I guess in my context with young girls writing, what would be your tips for those that probably haven't had that breadth of life experience? What would be some ways to explore creative writing without, I guess, that personal experience?
Yeah, and the answer clearly isn't try to buy some horse heads. I think the thing about experience and the write what you know kind of thing is, I would say, rather than write what you know, value what you know. There are other things to write as well. I think value what you know and write what you want, write what seems interesting to you. One thing that they've got, that young writers have got now that I didn't have when I was growing up, is they're likely to have a good broadband connection. So they can, any small thing that strikes them as interesting, they can find out whatever they need to about it. they can also travel using that. So they can broaden their experiences. And I think the thing about that is whatever gets you started, you can go looking for more in ways that just weren't around until recently. So for some years now, when I've written things, I mean, early on, the vast majority of my work was set in Brisbane and southeast Queensland. I knew those places really well. I could go to the places and check things out if I wanted them to be factual. And I still set some things here, but I set things further afield now as well. So that if I think about my novellas, the third in the series, Vancouver, happens partly in Vancouver. I've been to Vancouver, but only briefly. So the guy goes to a hotel that I was at years ago, but I went to the hotel website to get the details right and find out where the rooms were and see what the function room looked like. And I'm a big fan of imagination, but I also think there's no reason imagination shouldn't be fueled by a whole lot of real world details. You find out a lot of stuff and you get to decide which ones are going to help you take your story forward and reveal your characters in interesting ways, and which ones might trigger some piece of invention of your own. So I realised with this novella though that my character was flying into Vancouver and being picked up by someone and driven to a town in the north of Washington State where I'd never been. So I spent 3 days on Google Street View driving from Vancouver Airport to Bellingham in Washington State. And I knew what I wanted to reveal during that drive. And what I needed to find on that drive was the cues that would bring that to the surface as though with no effort at all. I mean, one of the things you want is for your writing to look unwritten, to look as though it's just connecting with the characters and there's no author fingerprint on it. And that's a really good way of doing that. So I think, even from the smallest ideas, get online and start going down rabbit holes, start following tangents, start discovering things. It doesn't matter if most of them don't take you forward, because some of them will. You'll have a good time along the way. And you can discover lots of things you might do with your story, and lots of details that might be really valuable in your story. And the more you discover, the less you have to invent, but the more scope you have to invent, because the more stimuli you have for invention. So that's what I'd say. I'd say writing is not about having a life that means you've got a brilliant story idea in your head to start with. It's about noticing the potential in small ideas when you have them, and asking questions of those small ideas. People tell you stories all the time. Just like your students, I have never purchased a horse head, but I know someone who told me about that. I have had a bad experience trying to buy ice cream and I'm still getting over it. But they might have had experiences like that too. So the two experiences at the heart of this story, one was the purchase of ice cream, which many of us have done, and the other is the purchase of horse heads, which I, the writer of the story, didn't do. I heard about it from someone. It's about noticing these things and being interested in them and asking questions of them, going, who might that happen to? Why might they be doing that? What's at stake for them when they do it? Is it going to be a success or not? It's these questions that create the stories. And there's no genius in the questions. There's just the key thing is to give yourself permission to ask them, see that as a legitimate and important part of the process, and enjoy that, and create all kinds of potential stories, and then discover the one you really want to tell. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nick, for coming to speak to us today. There's a lot of, what I picked up was how much thinking and an investigation, as you finished with there comes between, I have to write a story and it was a dark and stormy night. There's all that thinking is very instructive as to why it works. I know, and you connect with people's real lives, and I know I only read those novellas a year ago and I always forget small details. I've forgotten half of those details, but they come back to life and I remember those characters with clarity. I remember how I felt for them. I remember, how I was moved by each of the things that happened to them. And to me, they're the books that I want to go back to, and they're the books I want to share with kids. So thank you for being memorable, real and compelling in telling your stories today about how you do what you do. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.